And as Zach said, I'm talking about telecommunications. And in this particular case, from the bottom of the sea to the moon, Menzies and Australia's communications golden age. Now, I'm a political scientist, not a historian, but my PhD was actually about telecommunications, a comparison of communications policy from the time of the telegraph to broadband. So it was really interesting to engage at a very sort of personal level with Menzies and his involvement in what I would call the golden age of Australia's telecommunications. So what I want to do is I'll just start with my main sort of premise or what I'm focusing on. There are a few different issues that I could focus on. One of the types of technologies and how that was sort of brought about, and the other is the sort of leadership of Menzies in doing that. But it's really interesting that Menzies is elusive in terms of a leadership style when it comes to his embracing of science and technology more generally. And in my previous presentation in the chapter in the current issue or volume, it was the same thing. Menzies was very much about enabling nuclear to occur, as opposed to being one of the main drivers. And we find that too in telecommunications. And hopefully by the end of this, I'll have explained that sufficiently. So my main argument in looking at this golden age is that Menzies was an enabler of science and technology, and that he was open to new technologies. But what's really interesting is he was always self-deprecating about his scientific knowledge. And in almost all of the photos when he's dealing with telecoms or satellites or nuclear or any of these sort of major advancements in science and technology, he made claims that he basically knew nothing, that he was leaving it to all of the scientists to, to go ahead and do what the magic that they did. And in many of the photos, he's also making fun of himself. So it's really interesting that he ironically used this self-deprecating sense of humor in relation to science and technology, but his opponents, particularly his future opponents, have actually used that self-deprecation and weaponized it to make out that he was an old fogey who wasn't interested in science and technology. So there's a fair bit of sort of irony there. And I'll talk about some of those issues as well. But one of the things that we notice most about Menzies is that he was able to change when he was presented with new facts. So, and we can see this in a number of different policy issues. If you look before the Second World War, for example, he was very much on the side of appeasement, as many others were. Then after the war, he was anti-appeasement. He saw that it didn't work, and so a lot of this sort of policy learning. And obviously, he's been criticised for some of these things, but in general, he's demonstrated that he was able to actually change his view on things when he was presented with new facts. And it's quite interesting at the moment looking at our own energy policy where we're not seeing that occur in the industry. But again, in this particular chapter, I don't intend looking too much at the present and sort of recasting history in that way. But I just make the point that when we look at Menzies in this particular golden age era, he was very open to new technologies, very much a promoter of science and technology, and he did this through various ways. So these characteristics of Menzies, in my view, facilitated Australia's communications golden age. So when we look at Menzies' critics, it's interesting that, as I said, that they actually use some of his own attempts at humour and weaponize those against him. So to Menzies, to his critics, Menzies was a pompous, anachronistic, forelock-tugging establishment figure who held back the tide of Australia's potential and denied the country its independent greatness. And it's interesting that this quote is actually from a journalist who had this view, but then went and sort of relearnt their history of this particular period, because this was the sort of 1980s and beyond story that they'd been told. And they actually went back and rediscovered that their own view that had been sort of given to them through their education of the 1980s and beyond was actually quite incorrect. But again, Paul Keating said of this period that it was the golden age when Australia was injected with a near lethal dose of old fogyism by the Conservative parties, when they put the country into neutral and where we gently ground to a halt in the nowhere land of the early 1980s. So we have this idea of a golden age that we can actually see in terms of submarine cables, coaxial cables between the three major capitals, delivering subscriber dialing and international phone calls and all these sorts of things. Yet we have Menzies' opponents saying that he basically did nothing and we ground to a halt in terms of technology. And again, when we look at the actual technologies, and it's not just telecommunications, but also nuclear and all forms of science and science promotion, we find that nothing could actually be further from the truth. Now, this photo is interesting. This is actually a photo of Menzies applauding himself while making his own policy speech on TV in 1960. So Menzies merely endured television, and he was very much the orator, and he really enjoyed radio as a medium. But when television came out, he wasn't a great fan of using the medium, even though he appreciated that it was a medium for the future. So he actually played this major role in a golden age and established the scientific capabilities for Australia, or enabled these scientific capabilities that have actually endured beyond his tenure. So we have this sort of enduring the new technologies, but then also enabling them to continue on. And this photo, as I said, so this was actually the first time that Menzies had used television to deliver a policy speech. And as you can see, he's sitting at home watching himself, and you can tell from the photo that he's actually quite chuffed about his performance. So there's a few things though that predate the golden age, and again, this is something that Menzies is not given credit for. Menzies actually launched Australia Calling, which later became Radio Australia, and he did this in 1939, and it was a multilingual service using shortwave radio to counter disinformation during the Second World War. So, shortwave radio, it's an old-fashioned term. It is effectively high frequency, or HF frequency, but it kind of overlaps different measures because of the thing of the time. But in effect, it's a form of radio that bounces off the ionosphere and enables almost global communication when the atmospheric conditions are right. And so from 1939 onwards, Australia actually started delivering news services and anti-propaganda. In some ways, you can argue its own propaganda, and beamed it into Asia in particular as a way to counter the propaganda that was occurring from Japan and Germany and Australia's enemies. And I don't think many people appreciate the extent that this new capability with shortwave radio actually impacted disinformation. And here we are now in modern telecommunications dealing with exactly the same things and looking at ways to counter them. But the ways that we're trying to counter them are not really about providing alternative information, but they're about trying to lock down those systems. So again, it's a very different approach that Menzies took. Now, of course, Menzies didn't drive this. He wasn't necessarily a driver of it, but he certainly embraced the technology and used this and incorporated this into his sort of policy approach more generally. Now, I'll come to this a little bit later. Probably one of the key things is Menzies' tenure began in a really interesting period in Australian history, and it followed the Chifley government. And of course, the Chifley government had picked up after the death of Curtin. And so we see this period in the post Second World War era where there are lots of things happening, and lots of things that are happening are the fallout between Australia and the UK. At the same time, Australia is still working with the UK for defence and for new technologies, including telecommunications and also energy, but at the same time, embracing a new relationship with the United States. It's interesting that one of the quotes I read from MacArthur said that basically MacArthur viewed Australia as a place for the United States to launch its attacks from. It wasn't necessarily about being in Australia to defend Australia. Now, I'm not sure where that sort of rabbit hole leads just yet, but it's interesting that many of us, including myself, would view the United States of having lost tens of thousands of lives of their soldiers defending Australia. Whether or not that was necessarily about protecting Australia as opposed to protecting the US's own interests is probably immaterial. It's a simple fact that that had occurred. But what I think we don't really appreciate about this telecommunications golden age in particular is how technology transfer actually occurred between Australia and the United States. Now, we saw both the Chifley government was interested in this as well. Now, obviously, when Menzies took over, things changed and became the situation was much more ripe in order to take on these new technologies. But I just want to give you a couple of other examples of this golden age. So the first is Menzies launching the Trans-Tasman link of the compact cable. And the compact was basically the Commonwealth Pacific submarine cable system. And this occurred in 1962. And basically the cable landed at Bondi in Sydney, and it connected New Zealand and Australia. The entire cable network connected the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So Queen Elizabeth II officially opened Compact in 1963. And of course, using the cable, she was able to do this simultaneously, addressing London, Ottawa, Sydney, and Wellington. So this really represents a major step forward. And the reason it's a major step forward is because previously wireless telegraphy existed. So we could have these communications, but these communications were conducted using Morse code. And we didn't have the voice-to-voice capability that the compact cable enabled. There's also the CCOM cable. CCOM connected Australia through Hong Kong. It landed at Cairns, and there was a microwave link from Cairns to Sydney. And microwave is one of those technologies in telecommunications that was given a really bad rap, particularly by Paul Keating in his tenure. But a lot of it was political. But look, even my own broadband network in regional Australia runs on a microwave link. So it's interesting that these technologies were available in Menzies' time, and they're still being used today to deliver high-speed broadband. And this is a use that wasn't foreseen at the time. It was simply for voice and faxes and other sorts of things. So another interesting thing too is that it's quite serendipitous. There's a lot of serendipity in the Menzies era, and one of those is the 1956 Olympic Games that were held in Melbourne. So this was a sort of major driver to get the three major capitals, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Canberra, I guess, connected in through this coaxial cable. Now, we might sort of see this as like, oh well, it wasn't Menzies, it was the Olympic Games required it, so it happened. But it's interesting that when we had the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane, we didn't have the same sort of embracing of the technology. So there's something about Menzies and his abilities or capabilities as an enabler that made sure that these things happen, as opposed to what we saw with NBN in Brisbane, where it was simply just not happening, not being delivered in time because it wasn't being given the priority. So there's elements of prioritization of science and technology that sort of forms part of this golden age that stems from Menzies. So Another major element, and this is so we're just talking about from the compact being under the sea and now to the moon, and effectively Menzies officially opened the Tidbinbilla Deep Space Tracking Station along with NASA officials who visited in 1965. And this is a photo of him walking near the satellite, just near Canberra. Now, the interesting thing is that Chifley's government had actually organised a good deal of this in 1946, as they'd done with nuclear as well. But again, I don't think we appreciate, at least from the available history, how important Menzies as an enabler was when it comes to the actual technology transfer. So just because the Labor government had engaged with the US and was interested in receiving the technology, that didn't necessarily translate into the technology being delivered. And we saw this, of course, with nuclear, and that was the same with the British as well. So there are a few other things that are worth mentioning when it comes to Menzies, and I want to talk just now about the enabling issues. So, acknowledging the groundwork established by the Chifley government and the contemporaneous drivers for the 1956 Olympic Games, Menzies really was the keystone. He kept everything together. So, there's a number of sort of side stories, and one is about Percy Spender and ANZUS. So, the ANZUS Treaty was really the sort of uh, enabling document that enabled technology transfer to occur, and it demonstrated Australia's commitment. So one of the reasons Australia committed to the Korean War, and it was the first country to side with the Americans in the UN force. And in my own visits to Korea, I've spent a fair bit of time conducting research along the DMZ in Korea. And there are people, local people, who still acknowledge Australia's input into their own defence. So it's important on a personal level for many Koreans, but it was also very important strategically in terms of Australia's relationship with the United States. Now, Percy Spender obviously spent a good deal of time organising this. Some argue that he was the architect of ANZUS. It's interesting in the memoirs, particularly the letters and other memoirs of Sir Robert, that he didn't seem to be a big fan of Percy Spender, and I know a lot of it has been written about this, and obviously I'd like to explore this more in terms of Menzies as an enabler. But in effect, without Menzies enabling these things to have happened, I don't think it would have brought everything together. Hence my idea of Menzies as a keystone and holding it all together. Now, Richard Casey earned the moniker Rocket Man, and this was to do with him embracing satellites. And it's really interesting. I see parallels between Richard Casey and Tony Staley in his role in bringing about OSAT and other advancements later on as well. And again, here we have coalition members who, according to the opposition narrative, were old fogies and not interested in new technologies. But the majority of these telecommunications technologies driven in Australia, particularly in the post-war era, have come about from the coalition, and a lot of that owes its foundations to Menzies' legacy. So it's interesting too that the Australian Academy of Science actually acknowledges Sir Robert's leadership and how this led to substantial advances in science and technology in Australia. And they mention things like telecommunications, like ANSTO, like the CSIRO, and also like the Australian National University. Now, again, there are all of these legacies from the Chifley government that are involved in that lead up, but it's really Menzies who cements them and brings about practical outcomes from these arrangements. And some of the other things to consider too are scholarships and even the Colombo plan. These enabled education to occur in Australia. And there's a lot of debate about Whitlam bringing in free education. But it was Menzies who brought about scholarships that were based on merit, and the scholarships were also means tested. So this, in effect, enabled the best and the brightest of our students to attend university. Now, obviously, it wasn't, universal, but at the same time, he was involved in encouraging or enabling people to achieve levels of education that previously they couldn't unless they were members of the elite. And I think that this role of Menzies in education and embracing science and technology is undervalued in the contemporary sort of view of his impact. Now, also, it's important to realise that Menzies' role in mediating between the UK and the US in Woomera, and also the involvement of the weapons testing, this actually led to Australia being able to launch its own satellite from Woomera, and I think it was the fourth country in the world to be able to do so. So for a very small country at the end of the earth, these were some magnificent achievements in terms of space technology, and a lot of this is because of the conditions that were established by Sir Robert. Um, I think also it's understated how the impact of ANZUS, or the impact that ANZUS had on the relationship between Australia and the UK. The UK were particularly upset. Churchill, in particular, was upset that Menzies went ahead with this with the US and didn't have the UK involved. Now, obviously, with AUKUS in present times, things have changed a bit. But it's interesting again that Menzies was sort of called an Anglophile who was British to his bootstraps, and that again these criticisms that he wasn't interested in. Changing with the times, and it's just simply not true. I mean, he actually actively embraced collaboration with the US. And again, if you look at his period in retirement, he spent a good time in the United States. And again, he was able to change his mind, at first thinking that the US was a very different beast than the Anglo culture that he was sort of used to in the empire. But over time, he came to appreciate the culture and developed friendships and other relationships that became really important in Australia, in the US, and particularly in enabling that transfer of satellite technology to Australia. Now, look, I've only mentioned a few of the um, technologies. There are other satellite systems that were established. Obviously, Parkes had been established. Parkes had been established before the war. It played a major role in later on after Menzies had retired, but in particular in the Apollo 13 rescue. Uh, Obviously, the Apollo 11 mission, Australia's satellite network was perfect in terms of location, that enabled the US to function here. Menzies made sure that it wasn't just Australia, the Australian public paying for these satellite services as well. His idea was that at least 50% should come from the private sector. And my understanding too is that it was the Rockefeller Institute and another, sorry, the name escapes me at the moment, but it's two American philanthropic organizations matched Australia dollar for dollar, and the US even put in extra. And Menzies makes a comment at one stage that even though we agreed dollar for dollar, I know for a fact that the US has put in much more than we agreed, and he was sort of trying to skirt around that, and again making a joke about it as if he'd done the dodgy on the US. And I just found that fascinating, that sense of humor that he has. It really isn't captured in the historic the way that the history of Menzies had been taught previously, at least. So and finally, Menzies' role in shaping technology transfer across communications and nuclear. A lot of this comes down to not only leadership, but the enabling relationships and the diplomacy that he was able to use. And I think too, again, just referring back to Spender and Casey, obviously they were very capable. played very important roles. But at the same time, they were part of Menzies' team. So Menzies was able to give them the freedom to pursue what they wanted to pursue, but at the same time, he was able to bring that into his government's overall approach. And now, obviously, in terms of the major benefits of the satellite network, these really occurred after Menzies' tenure, particularly with the moon landing. But it was a really important part of Australia's commitment to its strategic alliance with the United States. And the other thing that made it very worthwhile, and this is something that Menzies was always conscious of, was he was always conscious of the workforces that were available that had sufficient education to support these emerging industries. And this even goes into the mining sector. When he was looking at uranium, he didn't want uranium miners moving away from the coal sector. He wanted these things to develop organically and appropriately, as opposed to just sort of a free for all. And it's really interesting when we look at NBN and other more recent major infrastructure builds that we've had in Australia. We've seen the biggest problem has been the lack of a workforce to support the grand visions. So Menzies was very capable too in terms of managing skills, obviously not through his own portfolio, but certainly through his government and bringing everything together. So in many ways, he was the conductor of this golden age, as opposed to the person who knew everything about the technologies. So in effect, what I'm trying to say is that the portrayal of Menzies and the coalition since as anti-science and anti-future for political gain denies his rightful place in Australia's technological advancement. And so that's what I'm hoping to be able to do. And like I said, I'll be focusing on the idea of Menzies as the keystone that held it all together, that enabled this golden age. But otherwise, thank you. I hope that time is good for you, Zach, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Michael. A little over time, but we might have time for one or two questions if anyone has one. I'll just ask Michael, this might be like outside of the purview of your paper, but I was interested with that Commonwealth cable network, the exclusion of South Africa, considering certainly in the early 60s and even before that, when the actual logistics would have been put into place, South Africa was generally considered one of the dominions on the same level as Australia or Canada or New Zealand. Do you know if this was a sort of logistical choice, or did it reflect sort of political realities and South Africa becoming less of a sort of central part of the Commonwealth?
Zach, I'm not sure, to be honest, but I'm certain there was a logistical element. So basically, you had to have the sort of Atlantic crossing, and this reflected historical trends as well. The telegraph played a really important part in the Crimean War. So the Brits had already established sort of these cable networks, in the 19th century, and John Spender basically was the person who owned all of the out of country networks, and he played a major role in connecting Australia to the Java cable. So our overland telegraph line gets all the focus, but there's so much that had to do with these submarine cables. Look, I suspect it was the logistics. It would have been a different network, but again, I'm not sure, and that's a really interesting point that I'd be happy to look at.
Thank you. If there's no further questions, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Zach. Cheers.
We now move on. So with having a Zoom from Madrid,